Okay, today we're going to be talking about the four different types of connective tissue. As you can see here by the title page, we'll be talking about epithelium, connective, muscle, and nerve. Again, these are the four primary types of tissues. Now, nervous tissue and muscle tissue, I think, are the easiest to learn. Epithelium and connective, a little bit more challenging because there are more subcategories under each of them. I think of the two, epithelium and connective, I think epithelium is a little bit easier than connective. Okay, so let's take a look at these different classifications first. This has shown up in the past on an older Connect quiz, and it was kind of like drag and drop. Now, when we look at epithelial tissue, which is the first tissue that I'll be talking about, it can be classified by the number of cell layers and the shape of the cell at the apical surface, meaning at the apex, at the top layer. So when we talk about epithelium, we can look at the number of cell layers, and they could be one cell layer thick, or they can be multiple cell layers thick. So if it's one cell layer thick, we always refer to it as simple. And if it's multiple layers, we refer to it as stratified. Okay, so that's the first thing. When we talk about the shape of the cell shape is typically one of three different shapes. If they are cube shaped, we call it cuboidal. If they are column shaped, like a building, tall columns, we call them columnar. And if they are flat and irregular shaped, we call it squamous. So we have squamous cells, cuboidal cells, and columnar cells. And if they're one cell layer thick, we call them simple. And if they're multiple layers, we call them stratified. And in terms of function, right, structure determines function, if something is one cell layer thick versus multiple cell layers thick, if it's one cell layer thick, it means things can cross through that barrier easily. Things can diffuse or pass through that barrier or membrane much easier. But if it's multiple layers are usually used for protection, kind of like the skin, right? The top layer of the skin of the epidermis is multiple layers for protection. Okay, now we'll go through epithelium in quite some detail. When we talk about neural tissue or nervous tissue, this is a network of specialized cells that's going to monitor the internal and external environment. And it's going to initiate commands throughout the body, right? It's the command center. So it's taking in information, it's processing it, and it's going to send out some motor command or motor information to tell the body what to do. When we talk about muscle tissue, muscle comes in three different flavors: skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. Skeletal is a type of muscle that attaches to your skeleton. Cardiac refers to the heart, and smooth refers to your viscera and to your organs and to blood vessels. Your skeletal muscle is the only one of the three that are voluntary. You have conscious voluntary control over your biceps and triceps, but you don't have voluntary conscious control over how many beats per minute your heart can contract, or dilating the trachea, or constricting your arteries, right? We don't have voluntary conscious control. Muscle tissue is also widely distributed through the body and allows for movement of the skeleton. Right? It's the only type of tissue that can do that. Of all the tissues, the most abundant is connective tissue. It's the most abundant and widely distributed throughout the body as connective. Epithelium forms the surface layer of the body. It also lines cavities, within the body. It lines the hollow organs and structures, and it makes up most of your glands. Now, epithelial tissue is made up of a bunch of cells that are packed closely together, whereas connective tissue is made up of cells that are not packed closely together but are spread out and has lots of extracellular matrix. That's connective tissue. Epithelium doesn't have a lot of extracellular matrix. Okay. Nervous tissue is also composed of two types of cells, and of the two, only one of them is electrically excitable. That's the neuron. The neuron is electrically excitable, and glial cells, these are supporting cells. That's what glial cells are. They're supporting. So we're going to look at these tissues. They all have different structures or different patterns, different form, which means they all have different function. These tissues are organized into organs, right? When certain tissues have similar functions, they're going to make organs like the heart and the kidneys and the lungs. When we study tissues, we call it histology. Remember, we said when we study cells, we call it cytology, but tissues, histology. So we're going to start with epithelium first. Now, epithelium is going to be like a lining or a type of covering type of tissue. It's going to cover the external surface of the body. And the external surface of the body, if we look at the skin, that superficial layer is called the epidermis. Right? So the superficial layer of skin, epidermis, it's going to have 5 different layers to it. And then deep to it is the dermis. And then deep to that would be the subcutaneous or the hypodermis. Epithelium is also going to line the body cavities and tubules. What do we mean by tubules? It's in the word. Tubes. The esophagus is a tube. The trachea is a tube. Your blood vessels are tubes. The respiratory tract is a tube. The digestive tract is a long tube. The urinary tract. Tracts and tubes are kind of synonymous. Okay. And glands, these are also specialized epithelium, like your mammary glands, your sweat glands, the sudiferous glands, sebaceous glands, right? Sweat glands and oil glands, those are all composed of epithelium. So some of the function is for protection, absorption, filtration, excretion, secretion, and even sensory. We talk about protection, just think of the skin. The skin protects us against any type of excessive friction or against a bacterial invasion or from chemicals from damaging the internal body. We have the skin to protect it. Then we also have ciliated epithelium. Remember cilia, we learned about that when we talked about the cell. The cilia epithelium, these are typically found in the respiratory tract. And they're going to sweep dust upward, right? Because these cilia are beating rhythmically upward. So when you breathe in debris, the mucus that sits on the cilia traps the dust. And there are little cells there that are called goblet cells deep in the trachea. And these goblet cells produce mucus, and the mucus sticks to the cilia that are beating upward. So when you breathe air in, if there's any foreign dust particles, it's not going to make it into your lungs. It's going to stick. It's going to stick to the airway. And then you can do that, and you push it up and out. Okay? Smoking tends to paralyze these cilia. They tend to paralyze them or they burn them off, and that becomes a problem. It can actually create metaplasia, where the ciliated columnar epithelium of the airway become squamous cells. And that becomes a problem because you get squamous cell carcinoma. Not a good thing. Absorption. We have epithelium in the digestive tract, like the stomach and the small intestine. So you can absorb nutrients. Filtration. When you cover the kidneys, That's in anatomy and physiology too, but when you cover the kidneys, you will learn a part of the kidney referred to as the nephron. And the nephron is the functional unit of the kidney. And kidneys have millions of nephrons, and they are filtering and they are eliminating, right? They filter things out, they can reabsorb things, and they can excrete things through urination. So epithelium is needed in the kidneys. Excretion, as we said, you can filter, you can absorb, and you can eliminate or excrete from the body. And glands, which are specialized epithelium, can also secrete, like sweat glands, oil glands, and mammary glands, and even ceruminous glands of the ear. Then we have sensory reception. The epithelium that covers the body's surface contain many sensory organs. It's even the hairs on your arm. When the wind blows, it wiggles the hairs and it hits these, the nerve root plexus, and it sends information to maybe there's a mosquito or a spider or a bug that's crawling on you, right? It sends that feedback information. Cilia. Cilia are long, slender extensions of the plasma membrane, and they're going to help move secretions and fluids across the cell surface. So let me see if I can draw this out for you and give you an example here. Let me use this whiteboard here, and let's see if we can draw here. Let's make this, here is the windpipe, okay? And let's say we have these columnar cells. Remember I said columnar cells look like buildings or columns, except these are sideways, right? So we have these columnar cells here, and what's associated with these columnar cells are going to be, let's see if I can change the color here, are going to be cilia. Okay, so you have these little hairs, these little filaments that are coming off on both sides. Okay, now these cilia are going to be beating, they're going to be beating upward in this direction. Okay, so that when you breathe air in, we don't want filthy, dirty air making it into the lungs, right? These are like your bronchi. Let's say here's a lung and here's a lung, right? So you have oxygen coming in here, where you have gas exchange into the lungs. So we also have goblet cells. Remember I mentioned those before? So let's say these red circular things here are goblet cells. And cells are going to secrete mucus, and the mucus is going to stick here on the cilia. So now when you breathe stuff in, all the dust particles and all the junk is going to stick right here in the yellow. That's dust and debris. But thank goodness the cilia are beating in which direction? They're beating upward. So it prevents all the debris from making it into the lung. So those cilia are important. When people smoke, it paralyzes the cilia. And that's when you get tar and you get all those chemicals and you get all the chemical toxins which are carcinogenic into the circulatory system, because anything you breathe in gets into your bloodstream. Anything that's in your bloodstream is going to make it to the liver for detoxification. Okay, let's go back to my screen share now. Okay. So the cilia move secretions and fluids, as I showed you in that little screen share before with the trachea. Microvilli are similar to the cilia, but they're smaller projections. These are used for absorption and secretion. We have a lot of these microvilli found in the small intestines, especially the duodenum, for the absorption of nutrients. Now, remember I said before that epithelium, we classify it by the number of layers and the shape of the cell. We said if it's one cell layer thick, it's simple. And if it's more than one cell layer thick, we call it stratified. And we also name epithelium by its shape. It's either squamous, cuboidal, or columnar. So we have to look at the layers and go, okay, is it one cell layer? If it is, it's simple. Or is it multiple layers? Then it's stratified. Then we look at the shape. Does it look like a square cube? It's cuboidal. Does it look like a tall column? It's columnar. Does it look flat and irregular shaped? Then we call it squamous. So if it's one cell layer, simple cuboidal. One cell layer, simple columnar. One cell layer, simple squamous. Now, if we see that it's more than one cell layer, it's multiple, here it's two, then we call it stratified. And since these are cube shaped, stratified cuboidal. These are multiple layers of flat cells, so stratified squamous up at top. Now let's look at the simple columnar. Notice here that the nuclei are pretty much aligned. They're all even, but if we look here down below, you'll see that the nuclei are scattered at multiple levels. So it gives this visual, it gives this illusion that it's multiple layers when it's really not. It's still one layer. If you look, one layer, one, but the nuclei are at multiple levels. So it gives the illusion that it's stratified. So they call it pseudo, which means false, pseudo-stratified columnar. Now, transitional is found where we have organs that can alter in shape, like a urinary bladder. Your bladder can be full, and then it gets stretched out, and then you can empty your bladder, and it gets smaller. So when you have an organ that can alter in shape and size, the cells can alter and change their size. So when you see things of different shapes, we call it transitional because it goes through different transitions. Primarily, the famous organ that has transitional is the urinary bladder. Okay, so simple epithelium, one cell layer, stratified epithelium, multiple. If it's flat, irregular cells, we call it squamous. Those squamous cells function for protection, secretion, and diffusion, meaning things can pass through squamous cells. The cube-shaped cells, these are found in the nephron of the kidney, those tubules. They're used for secretion and absorption. Columnar cells, we're going to find these columnar in the respiratory tract as well as the digestive tract. So we name the epithelium based on that layer and the shape of the cell. It's at the top level, or the apical surface. Okay, the apical surface, or the surface that's closest to the lumen or the hull. Okay, pseudostratified epithelium, we told you that it's where the nuclei are at multiple levels, and it has this false appearance that it's stratified, so we call it pseudo-stratified, but it's really a simple layer. I showed you it was really only one cell layer thick. Often when we find pseudostratified epithelium, there's cilia on it. In that particular example that I drew with the trachea, that has pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium, right? God bless you. That's like a mouthful. Pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium, those are found in the windpipe. Transitional, we said these are found in organs that can be stretched, like the urinary bladder, the ureters, and even parts of the urethra. can really modify and alter their shape. So again, we can have simple squamous epithelium, simple cuboidal epithelium, and simple columnar epithelium. If it's stratified, stratified squamous, stratified cuboidal, stratified columnar, and then pseudostratified columnar, and then the transitional epithelium found with the urinary bladder. Okay, so this was a drag and drop on an older quiz not too long ago. So let's see if we can figure this out. Let's look at which one do I want to start with? Let's start with the bottom one first. This type of epithelium accommodates distension and relaxation with changes in organ volume, meaning the organ can increase in size and decrease like the urinary bladder, and that's where we have the transitional epithelium. When we have something that is one cell layer thick, things can diffuse and pass through it much easily. So when you have something that's one cell layer thick, like oxygen and carbon dioxide and nutrients can pass through that barrier. So when you have something that is simple squamous, that flat layer, it's irregular, that can function in diffusion, filtration, and secretion, and protection depending on the location. That's simple squamous. Simple cuboidal, somewhat similar. This can function in absorption, secretion, and protection. Absorption and secretion, we're thinking the kidneys. A specific part of the kidney called the proximal and distal convoluted tubule. So if you go and research kidney and you look at the nephron, you'll see that there's a proximal and a distal convoluted tubule, and they're made of simple cuboidal epithelium. Now, stratified squamous, this is multiple layers, right? In the epidermis of the skin, the top layer called the stratum corneum, it's like 25 to 30 layers of stratified squamous epithelium. So stratified squamous epithelium functions in protection of the underlying layers. And I think of the stratum corneum of the skin, of the top layer, the epidermis. Here's the pseudostratified columnar. This epithelium functions in the movement of secretion like mucus across the apical surface. Remember when I drew out the trachea, the windpipe, and I drew out the columnar cells with the goblet cells that produce the mucus. And then it hits the cilia and it helps to move secretions across that top layer. So that's pseudo-stratified columnar. Okay, let's take a break right here and I will start the next recording and we'll start with connective tissue.